Hello, everyone. I am Jo Flick with the Montana State Library, and I'm here today with Kate Hampton from SHPO, which is short for the State Historic Preservation Office, which is a division of the Montana Historical Society. And Kate and I have actually worked together on a couple of projects across the state years ago, and she recently wrote and published this book, which I know a lot of you have heard about. And she's been traveling the state doing presentations, and we finally nailed down a date to get her presentation recorded for all of you. So that's why we're here today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it all over to you, Kate, and I'll keep an eye on the chat box and I'll bring any comments or questions to your attention. Thanks for being
That
here.
would be great. Oh, you bet. Thanks, Jo. I really am thrilled to be here. Good afternoon. It's great to talk with you about Montana's Carnegie Libraries, and I'd like to thank Jo and the State Library for inviting me. This is a fun venue. I've never done this kind of webinar before, so be patient with me if my technology is a little behind the times. So I'll just start then. And I always start off this talk thanking the people that helped for this project. Thanks to the Montana History Foundation, whose idea it was, especially Charlene Porcels, who brought this wonderful idea to fruition, not only to celebrate our state's Carnegie Libraries, but to also publish a book about them, the proceeds of which will be used to support their maintenance. So in the upper left-hand corner, you can see a picture of Charlene with her arm around Penelope Wilson. And it was actually Penelope Penny who came up with this idea. She's been a wonderful supporter of libraries, and she's based in Big Timber and has been a great friend of the Big Timber Public Library, Carnegie Library. And when they built their beautiful addition a few years ago, she was kind of behind it. And so Penny asked Charlene, what else can we do for libraries? How about a book? And that's how this great idea just got started. We also like to thank the Donnelly Foundation. It's important when you're a nonprofit to thank your funders. So we're going to do that. And all the individual donors who supported and continue to support our precious libraries. In the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see a picture of my friend, Dr. Mary Greenfield, who braved New York snow and cold to research the archives of the Carnegie Corporation at Columbia University. She took the subway up and the buses and got into that library, and she actually either scanned or copied every single piece of correspondence between the Carnegie Corporation and the people that lived in the state of Montana and sent them along, so that was valuable research. Tom Ferris, whose spectacular photos and infectious sense of humor made this project a pure joy. He's a professional photographer and actually the official photographer for the Montana Historical Society. And then in the upper right-hand corner, you can see a picture of Becca Cole, who was a longtime photo archivist at the Montana Historical Society and just has encyclopedic knowledge of historic photos across the state. And her mother worked at the Great Falls Carnegie Library, so she was especially happy to help us with this project, and we were just so grateful. And then a big shout out to the Montana State Librarians, the librarians and staff at each of these wonderful public libraries. Thank you guys so much, past and present. You and the many women's clubs members who support you are the real story here. Your enthusiasm, guidance, and endless expertise are truly worth celebrating. And it was a wonderful idea, and I'm so happy to have been asked to contribute to such a great project. So let's get started, and I always start with a little bit of a confession, and that is I am not from Montana. I have only lived here for going on 30 years, but I will never claim that I'm actually a Montanan. I actually grew up in Baltimore, and I'm pretty late to the party when it comes to celebrating these wonderful Carnegie Libraries. My public library growing up in Towson on the north side of the city was a modern affair. It was a big, hulking, brutalist building constructed in 1974 when I was 5 years old. It was stark and it was kind of imposing. Had this big, wide open space with these giant pillars, and it was always crowded. So I always kind of felt a little intimidated by it. But the best part of the whole building was, in order to get in, you had to climb up this giant 3-story ramp. And so all of my brothers and sisters and I would drive my mother absolutely crazy running up and down the ramp. I think we did that more often than we read books inside the library.
It's very Guggenheim, the ramp.
Yeah, it was a little googie. I think they were trying to go for that. It's a lot more brightly colored now than it used to be. It was always just that kind of concrete gray when I was growing up. They've brightened it up a bit.
They need a large column of Chihuly sculpture in the middle of that. That would be
I think so. We'd have fun designing this space, I think.
Yes.
So I will also let you know that across Montana, I always get this question, so I'm going to bring it right up to the front right away and tell you between 1901 and 1922, 17 Montana communities received gifts from the wealthiest man in the world, Andrew Carnegie, to construct their libraries. They are, in order of opening, Dillon, Miles City, Great Falls, Bozeman, Kalispell, Missoula, Livingston, Lewistown, Glasgow, Big Timber, Havre, Hamilton, Phillips County, which is Malta, yay Malta, Choteau County and Fort Benton, Bighorn County and Hardin, Red Lodge, and then Blaine County in Chinook. So those are the libraries we're going to be talking about today. But we'll go back to Baltimore for just a second. And I'll let you know that a private individual named Enoch Pratt funded Baltimore City's public library system beginning in 1882. The main branch that I've got a picture up of here opened in 1886. And once I was in college and living in the city, I loved to go to Pratt's main library. And it's there that I realized how a building's architecture could influence how I felt about going to that place, in this case a library. There, I felt welcome and warm. I could find a nook to read by natural light and scour stacks endlessly. I felt privileged to be there. And Andrew Carnegie admired Enoch Pratt's legacy in Baltimore and even referred to it as a model for others in his important 1889 essay called The Gospel of Wealth. And he said about Pratt, "Many free libraries have been established in our country, but none that I know of with such wisdom as the Pratt Library of Baltimore. Mr. Pratt presented the city of Baltimore $1 million, requiring it to pay 5% per annum, amounting to $50,000 per year, which is to be devoted to the maintenance and development of the library and its branches." He went on to say, "Mr. Pratt has done more for the genuine progress of the people than has been done by all the contributions of all the millionaires and rich people to help those who cannot help themselves. The one wise administrator of his surplus has poured his fertilizing stream upon the soil that was ready to receive it and return 100-fold." So he really did enjoy giving these libraries and was really quite inspired by Pratt. So that's my connection that gives Baltimore a little bit of cred. In 1906, the Carnegie Corporation gifted $500,000 to the Pratt Library to build 20 new library branches in Baltimore. And by 1906, Montana already boasted 7 Carnegie libraries. And rather than requiring the 5% of the gift amount for maintenance, Carnegie required 10%. So to receive a $15,000 for a building, for example, the city of Bozeman had to agree to provide at least $1,500 per year in perpetuity for collections and maintenance. Most of the buildings Carnegie funded continue to serve their patrons as libraries, while others have been adapted for use as cultural centers and offices here in Montana. And 15 remain standing, and they're important in Montana, and they're important touchstones for their communities and for all of us, really. I'll jump into a little bit of history about Andrew Carnegie himself. He was an interesting character, and he was certainly no saint, but he did try to justify his ardent belief in capitalism through a philosophy of social Darwinism. seems to me he would have had to work hard to justify his actions and the actions of his management team to his family. And that's because his father, William Carnegie, was a skilled damask linen hand loom weaver in Scotland before the introduction of mechanized weaving and machines. And he established a pretty nice middle-class family life for himself. But the Industrial Revolution pushed his skilled laborers out of work. The senior Carnegie was a leader among other craftsmen among the Charterist movements, which was a working-class reform movement in Britain. As the family fell into poverty, Carnegie's mother took in odd jobs, and in 1848, the family borrowed money to move to the Scottish enclave in Allegheny City, which is now part of Pittsburgh. And if you go to Pittsburgh, there aren't a whole lot of buildings and places directly associated with Carnegie's childhood. They've all been pretty much torn down, including where his home was as a teenager and the factory where he worked. Those locations are actually now where the new stadium is that overlooks the river on the north side of Pittsburgh. But there is one place that's still standing, and it's this home that I have up on the screen right now. When 13-year-old Andrew Carnegie found employment at a cotton factory, he was first a bobbin boy, then an engineer's assistant, responsible for stoking the boilers and running the engine in the cellar for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. On Saturdays, Carnegie found respite and inspiration at a local private library. Businessman and iron manufacturer Colonel James Anderson offered his collection of 400 books to working boys, of course boys, not girls. Boys could use it, and this generosity had a lasting impact on Carnegie. And if I say Carnegie, that's actually the proper pronunciation. I grew up saying Carnegie, as most people did. So if I go back and forth, forgive me, but Carnegie is the proper pronunciation. So the ambitious Carnegie worked hard, and he became superintendent for the Pennsylvania Railroad by his early 20s. And he invested his money wisely in materials and industry. I have the Sanborn map up from 1884 just to give you an idea of where Allegheny City is. It's a neighborhood now in Pittsburgh. It's been engulfed by greater Pittsburgh, but it's right where the rivers come together, the three rivers of Pittsburgh on the north side of the rivers.
We can see your cursor.
So Carnegie turned to the steel industry in the 1870s, and by 1892, his Carnegie Steel Company was one of the most influential and successful enterprises in the world. And that's a picture of the elder boy there is Carnegie himself, and the younger boy is Thomas, who was his right-hand man through all of the steel company days, and he was a general manager for his company. And Thomas actually became quite wealthy himself. He didn't have the same pact that Andrew Carnegie did. Thomas actually held on to his money and didn't give it all away the way his brother Andrew did. So Carnegie believed that the rich had a responsibility to give away their wealth in a way that promoted, quote, real and permanent good in the world, close quote, and that helped people help themselves. His visits to Colonel Anderson's library as a youth influenced his decision to fund libraries, and he determined that a library constituted the best gift to give to a community. He explained his philosophy in 2 articles printed in the North American Review in 1889. Together they were reprinted as The Gospel of Wealth. And in it, Carnegie acknowledged the rift between the rich and the poor, but determined that it was necessary, that fruitful competition between the economically powerful not only increased the upper class's wealth, but also raised the fortunes of the working class. He wrote that the law of competition may sometimes be hard for the individual. It is best for the race because it ensures the survival of the fittest in every department. We accept and welcome, therefore, concentration of business, industrial, and commercial in the hands of a few, and that the law of competition between these as being not only beneficial, but essential for the future progress of the race. So he was a real trickle-down kind of guy before that term became popular. He believed that the wealthy were those that had a special talent for organization and management working in a free capitalistic society, and that their inevitable accumulation of wealth was good for everybody. He also argued that those blessed with these talents had the responsibility to thoughtfully give their wealth away within their lifetimes. He did not believe in simply giving money to the poor, but instead to give to causes that would help the worthy poor, and he always kind of clarified that it was the worthy poor he wanted to help, to improve themselves. Again, he wrote, quote, "The man of wealth thus becoming the mere agent and trustee for his poorer brethren, bringing to their service his superior wisdom, experience, and ability to administer, doing for them better than they would or could do for themselves." So he really had a pretty inflated vision of himself. And I suppose that's how he justified his actions, despite the fact that his father was very pro-union. By the time Carnegie wrote The Gospel of Wealth, he had already determined that libraries were the ideal venue for giving. In 1883, he funded construction of a free public library in his birthplace in Scotland. Next, he funded libraries in southwest Pennsylvania, the place where he earned his fortune. And then he expanded his sphere of generosity and began funding additional locales in 1898. Over the next 24 years, just 6 states, Indiana, California, Ohio, New York, Illinois, and Iowa, accounted for more than 1/3 of the 1,689 Carnegie-funded libraries around the country. Montana's 17 Carnegie gifts were about average for the remaining states and territories. And I'm not quite sure, as you can see on the map, why there are concentrations in those particular states like California and Illinois. And the only thing I can determine is just more people asked for money. Because in the beginning of this process for applying for Carnegie funds, it was pretty darn simple. What they would do is they would write to Andrew Carnegie and request money to build a library. The inquiry needed only to state the town's population, a commitment to securing building lots, and a promise to pay to maintain the library into the future. Carnegie routinely gave at least $2 per resident for construction, and often more. Few specific architectural requirements accompanied the funding. In Montana, the 8 Carnegie libraries completed between 1902 and 1907 reflected this relative freedom of design. Dillon and Lewistown, pictured here, both incorporated exuberant stone edifices featuring local materials and craftsmanship. And the Dillon Library, boy, I just love these two so much. The Dillon Library is so sweet, and to me it looks a lot like a church. It looks like a little temple of books. And it even has a turret that goes up to a tiny room. The staircase winds up. And the interior is spectacular with wonderful woodwork that arches all the way up to the top of the peaked roof. And beautiful, beautiful arched windows. And I think one of the reasons it might look like a church, there are a couple reasons. First of all, the couple that kind of inspired the city to apply for the funds were a pastor and his wife. So they were very influential on how the building looked. It was also designed by Charles Hare, and Charles Hare in that year had just finished his designs for the Parmley Billings Memorial Library in Billings, which if you've been to it, it's now the Western the Western Heritage Center, and you'll see kind of that similar stone design, lots of arched windows, kind of a Romanesque feeling to it, and I think maybe he borrowed some design ideas from one he'd already designed, and that might be why Dillon looks the way it does. And then we look down in the lower right corner and we see Lewistown Public Library, designed by Jeff Tubb of the Tubb brothers. They employed masterful Croatian stoneworkers who were just masters at their trade and truly great artists. to design and build this building. Every stone was hand cut. Every detail is stone or applied terracotta. If you look at that wonderful bracketing underneath the roof eaves, those are carved stone brackets that support the roof. And a fun story about Jeff Tubb, he knew what he wanted his library to look like for the community, and he put excruciating care into designing it, and of course his workers were just amazing artists. And at the end, the building cost $14,000 to build. Well, Carnegie had only given the town $10,000. So when Jeff presented the bill and realized that they were about $4,000 short, Mr. Tubbs said, no, I'm going to forgive the rest of the bill because I made this library. We built it to look exactly the way it does, and I'm pleased with it, and it's my gift to the city. So that's one of the fun reasons, really an idea of the great community spirit that went into these beautiful, beautiful buildings. And it's still just as lovely today as it ever was, that Lewistown Library. So architect Charles Hare, who I mentioned before, designed the Dillon Public Library. He also designed the library in Miles City and Great Falls and Bozeman. And then George Shanley, another professional architect, designed the drawings for Kalispell, which is in the upper right-hand corner. And all four of these buildings embraced high-style elements, including domes, stone columns, deep dentiled overhangs, and highly decorative cornices. They're really wonderful. So the Miles City Library is the only one in this group that still functions as a library. The Kalispell Library, of course, is the Hockaday Museum of Art. The Bozeman Library in the lower left corner is a law office now, but it's been just beautifully restored and rehabilitated. And sadly, the Great Falls Library in the lower right-hand corner with that floor plan is no longer standing. When they constructed the new library, they did put it in the exact same place, so they took that particular building down. Great Falls was the most expensive library of the Montana Carnegies. It cost $50,000 to build. In Missoula and Livingston, the neoclassical revival style libraries included grandly scaled entries and windows. I love this. The Missoula Public Library is actually the only one where Carnegie came back. They asked for more money for an addition, and James Bertram, his secretary, and Carnegie approved an addition to an existing library. It's the only time in Montana I ever saw that documented. Most of the time people asked and they said absolutely not. So if you look at the Missoula Library, which is the Missoula Art Center now, you can see the original Gibson design of the beautiful orangey brick and blonde brick details on the first level. And then the second level is almost kind of craftsman. I'm sorry I don't have a wider shot of it, with the stucco and kind of coining and banked windows. So it's an unusual design, but it works. And of course the Livingston Library has several additions on it, but they are all towards the back of the building, and so that beautiful front has not been interfered with. And it's just, I was just there last week. It looks great. By 1906, Andrew Carnegie's library program and his other charitable projects consumed so much of his time that he turned increasingly to his longtime personal secretary, James Bertram, to handle the details of the program. And Bertram created a stricter set of procedures for applicants, with specific language for communities to use when establishing their local library funds and accepting Carnegie's gift. Bertram also created guidelines for library design that favored simple yet dignified construction and emphasized usable space and efficiency. Looking for guidance from professional librarians rather than architects, he demanded efficient designs that focused less on ornamentation and more on the practical business of the libraries. These buildings are dignified and inviting, but not ostentatious. And really, James Bertram did not like architects. He didn't want to correspond with architects. He didn't want to go back and forth. He didn't want any drawings set up on boards. He didn't want things rolled up in tubes. He wanted near complete drawings mailed to him once, folded carefully, and put into an envelope. And if you think about it, it makes sense. He didn't want to have all these tubes and hard surfaces, hard framed pictures in his office when he was dealing with nearly 1,700 communities asking him for money and dealing with all that. I'm sure his office was overwhelmed with all kinds of paperwork, and he didn't want more. He also kind of thought that architects were a bit egotistical and often designed for their own edification rather than the true purpose of the building. He really, really respected professional librarians and asked for their input and guidance when he was making his own design guidelines and when he was dealing with individual communities, and we'll hear about that later. In 1911, Carnegie formed the Carnegie Corporation of New York to officially administer his charitable endeavors and chose Bertram as the corporation's founding secretary. That year, Bertram began to distribute his notes on the erection of library buildings, which offered sample floor plans for small and medium-sized libraries. And you can see those floor plans here. And you might notice at the bottom of that picture, the caption says, on the notes of erection of library buildings. You might notice buildings is misspelled, according to us. And that's because Andrew Carnegie is an odd man, and he really believed that the English language had way too many letters within their words, and he encouraged and even required his staff to use spellings that eliminated unnecessary vowels and consonants. So when you're reading all the correspondence between the libraries and the locals and Bertram, buildings is always spelled Bildings. So the U is missing. He even
I just want to say,
tried to get a congressional law through, a bill through, that would officially change the U.S. language to this more efficient spelling. He really believed in it, and obviously he did not succeed in getting that passed through Congress. But he was still a pretty powerful powerful guy anyway. So looking for guidance, he really did depend on professional librarians saying what they needed. And the professional librarians, of course, said what you'd expect them to say. We don't want all of these tiny nooks and crannies and alcoves. We don't want tall bookshelves that we have to use ladders to climb up and down to retrieve books. We want low tables and bookcases and a centralized circulation desk so that we can see what's going on in all parts of the building, even with a minimal staff. And that's what we came up with. So Bertram's new guidelines also required a single point of contact between himself and the community, verifiable population numbers, and draft architectural drawings for his review. 9 Montana communities proved themselves willing and able to meet these requirements. Following these exacting procedures generally resulted in more correspondence and longer periods of negotiation between the corporation and its applicants. Each of the libraries in Montana's second wave displayed the architectural restraint advocated by Bertram and often necessitated by cost and availability of materials. Beginning with the library in Glasgow, Montana, which is unfortunately one of the ones that is no longer standing, these Carnegie Libraries featured brick veneer exteriors, centered entries set off by pilasters or columns, rectangular footprints, flat or hipped roofs, modest cornices, and single stories atop daylight basements. The now Carnegie Classic architectural style. The main floors contained a central circulation desk, stacks, and reading rooms, while the basements housed space for an assembly or lecture room with separate access from the main entry. Mechanical rooms and restrooms were also typically located in the basement. And so this Glasgow Public Library is a good example of that Carnegie Classic. You can see it's not quite, it's got some hints of classicism, it's got some hints of columns and pilasters and a pedimented entry, but not nearly as ornate as some of the earlier buildings were. So these common elements make the Carnegie Libraries built between 1909 and 1922 easily recognizable, and they stand as important visual landmarks in their community's civic landscapes. Of course, pictured here is the Big Timber Public Library and the Red Lodge Public Library as well. A little history about early libraries in Montana. As we know, books are heavy, they're fragile, and they take up a lot of room. And you can see why they were a relatively rare commodity in the Rocky Mountain West during the 19th century, especially before the railroads. But sometimes they served an essential purpose. And it wouldn't be a Montana talk if I didn't bring up good old Lewis and Clark, who traveled through the region with a library of scientific tomes, reference books, a history of Louisiana, and maps essential to their core of discovery success. On May 14, 1905, Sacagawea famously saved many of the Corps' books when one of the expedition's canoes overturned in the Missouri. Other explorers and fur traders also carried valued volumes with them or sought them out when they came to the territory. Fort McKenzie, near present-day Loma, boasted one of Montana's very first libraries. Between 1833 and 1844, this collection, quote, contained a little of everything, science, history, poetry, and fiction. In 1861, the James and Granville Stewart brothers famously rode 150 miles from the Deer Lodge Valley to the Bitterroot to purchase books from a collection there. And actually in the Bitterroot, there was a wonderful collection right there at St. Mary's Mission. The picture in the middle here is Father Ravali's library in his small building, his small home on the St. Mary's Mission campus. 2 years later, John Mullen described the book collection at Fort Owen as the finest he had ever seen in the Pacific Northwest. And as elsewhere in the United States, Montana's first library were accessed through membership or subscriptions. One of the first publicly accessible subscription libraries opened in Helena in 1868. Wrote one Helena resident, quote, "We're here where the allurements to vice are many, and the intellectual entertainments few, where hundreds of men have leisure and little acquaintance, and the gratification of their desire to read is otherwise expensive. The establishment of a circulating library and the maintenance of cheerful reading rooms is fraught with manifold benefits to the entire community," close quote. Really what they're writing about there is, of course, they had a lot of single men who liked to patronize the bars and the brothels around town, and they were fairly desperate to have an alternative means of recreation. Fort Benton and Deer Lodge soon followed, and Bozeman called for a public library in 1872. Virginia City, of course, was in there as well with a very early library. As the population increased over the next several decades, community leaders across the territory established libraries. These institutions were often simply a room in a private home, but they offered educational opportunities in the hopes that young men would find them a suitable alternative to saloons, gambling houses, and brothels. Local residents also believed that libraries might bring increased stability to their community. In Bozeman, for example, they really believed in the power of the library to turn young men from vice. When they were deciding whether or not or where to build their Carnegie Library, they looked all around the town. They were big proponents of what we call the City Beautiful movement there at the turn of the century. And in Bozeman, they really embraced this idea. And they thought if they just would build this big, beautiful building, then it would allure people to do the right thing and come and study in the library. And they thought it was so powerful that maybe they should just plunk it down there right off of Mendon Hall, directly across from the red light district, hoping that the gentleman would turn left into the library instead of turning right into those houses of ill repute. And my friend Tom Ferris, who took pictures for the book, is hilarious. And of course, what he says then is that Bozeman had the most intelligent and well-read hookers in the state. In 1883, the Montana Territorial Legislative Assembly empowered cities and towns to levy up to a 1 mil tax, $1 for every $1,000 of property value, to, quote, establish and maintain one free public library for use of its citizens. Several cities, including Helena, Butte, Dillon, Great Falls, Bozeman, and Glasgow, established library funds through taxation. The taxes paid for acquisition and maintenance, but most communities did not have the money to build a dedicated library building. And there were exceptions. The William H. Coors Memorial Library in Deer Lodge, the Hearst Free Library in Anaconda, the Butte Public Library, which unfortunately is no longer standing, it burned down, and the Parmley Billings Memorial Library that we talked about before. And you can look at that picture and remember what Dillon looked like, and you can see some of the similarities there. But they were all built with infusions of funds from wealthy local benefactors. Other towns housed their collections in cramped city halls or rented rooms. Dillon's library existed in, quote, a miserable wooden shack, and the Hamilton Library, they said, smelled like the livery next door. The Hamilton Library was housed in their city hall, in a room in the back of City Hall that was adjacent to the horse stalls that were used because the City Hall was also the fire engine building, and so they would have horses to pull the carriages, and the reading room and library stacks were located right next to those stalls, so they were desperate to get out of there. By 1900, the pressing need for dedicated library buildings coincided with the rise of progressive-era social organizations, a wave of new municipalities, and the availability of construction funds from Andrew Carnegie. In Montana, as in other states, women's clubs took up the task. Nationally, women's clubs had their origins as literary societies, and advocating for libraries was a natural extension of their mission. This was true in Montana, where formal and informal groups of women, from Missoula to Miles City and numerous communities in between, including the Fort Benton Women's Club pictured here, established book collections and reading rooms. As Montana's population mushroomed, these endeavors intersected with local government's desire to establish attractive civic institutions to bolster a sense of permanence. They want people to jump off the train and say, I'm not moving on, I'm going to stay here because this is such a beautiful, well-established community, and having a local library helped that. Andrew Carnegie's library program, dedicated to promoting the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding among the people of the United States, proved well suited to accomplishing these goals. Often, women's clubs took the lead in garnering names on petitions, corresponding with Carnegie and Bertram, and with fundraising. These ladies, I mean, the real story of establishing libraries across the state, Carnegie or not, really is the story of women gathering together and deciding that this is what needed to be done. The Fort Benton Women's Club still meets, as they have since its opening, in the library at Fort Benton, at the Choteau County Library, and as do the ladies in Big Timber and Livingston, all over the state. So their presence and their dedication continues. Of course, many of these groups are still an active part of Friends of Libraries across the state. In Montana, the early 1910s witnessed dramatic population increases, especially in the eastern part of the state, attributable to the opening of reservation lands to non-Indian settlement, boosterism, and the passage of the Enlarged Homestead Act of 1909. The Montana Library Association, the MLA, was established in 1906 and promoted libraries in these areas. The 1915 county library law allowed residents to petition their county governments to levy up to 2 mills to maintain a library. Spearheaded by Gertrude Buckhouse, the university librarian at Missoula and an MLA leader, the law gave Montana counties the authority to apply for Carnegie funds for the first time. Dedicated to the county library's program's success and its potential reach to rural Montanans, Buckhouse sometimes intervened with Bertram on the applicant's behalf, Bertram respected her professional expertise and not only welcomed but sought out her opinions and explanations. A couple of examples there. In Fort Benton, for example, there was quite a bit of controversy within the town about what the building would look like, where it would be located, whether there would be a dedicated library building at all. There were hundreds of pages of correspondence between the community and the Carnegie Corporation. And Bertram just didn't know what to make of it, heads or tails. People, different factions were arguing for different architects. And what Buckhouse did was she wrote to Bertram and said, you know what? How about if you just take a deep breath and don't give them your acceptance letter, don't let them know that you'll be giving them money until a new county commission has been established. And he took her advice and waited another extra 6 months until things came down and there were some commissioners that were more amenable to the needs of the library rather than the needs of non-professional librarians. And so Buckhouse really did influence him in that regard. The other one is down in Hardin at Bighorn Library. The drawings by the architect included a sink on the second story, which Bertram thought was a big no-no. He wanted all of the restrooms and all of kind of the mechanical equipment downstairs, and he wanted the upstairs to be dedicated strictly to books and circulation and reading rooms. But the librarians at Bighorn County were pretty darn insistent, and they wanted a sink at the entrance. And the reason they did is because the kids and the people would come in off the ranches, and they were very, very, often had very dirty hands, and they were very upset about the idea of people with dirty hands touching their precious books. And so they argued back and forth, and it wasn't until Gertrude Buckhouse wrote to James Bertram and said, no, really, their hands are filthy. Please allow them to have a sink on the first floor, that he acquiesced. And in fact, Hardin's library is the only one I know of that actually has a sink up there. So she really was influential not only in state library history, but in her interference and good interference in the Carnegie program. The flurry of settlement and construction that defined much of Montana history through the turn of the 20th century came to a quick end by the late 1910s. Widespread drought began in 1917 and placed enormous strain on the agricultural community. After World War I ended in 1918, speculative banking practices and the downturn of extractive industries such as logging and mining further contributed to the economic crisis in Montana during the 1920s. Montana was the only state to lose population between 1920 and 1930. Dependent on tax revenues, many local libraries struggled to stay fiscally sound through the 1930s. But despite the challenges, and often with the steady support of local women's clubs, Montana's 17 Carnegie Libraries remained open and steadily increased their collections and outreach efforts. Their services included branch libraries, rural delivery, and special children's programming. During the Great Depression, local public libraries functioned as information hubs, and they do now, of course, where farmers could learn about new agricultural methods and techniques. They also served and continue to serve as community gathering places. And for rural patrons, the arrival of a book truck or an excursion to the library in town offered respite from troubled times and the opportunity to connect with others. Montana's library's fortunes improved with the rest of the economy following World War II. In 1949, the MLA successfully petitioned the legislature to fund the State Library Commission, the SLC, and the SLC and its team of professional librarians supported local libraries by loaning books, providing field visits and trainings, and responding to librarians' inquiries for help and advice. Still, by 1954, approximately 1/4 of Montana's population lacked access to library services. That year, the legislature authorized a State Library Extension Commission, the SLEC, which was dedicated to founding new libraries, improving established libraries, and aiding in the establishment of traveling libraries. In Montana, the SLEC administered programs funded in part by the National Library Services Act of 1956, which was a landmark piece of legislation that offered funding for collections, staff, equipment, interlibrary loans, and bookmobile programs. It also supported the development of library federations, multi-county cooperative organizations that allowed libraries to share their resources. So pictured here is the Five Valleys bookmobile. From the mid-century, the Missoula Public Library was a leader in traveling library programs. And as early as 1926, that other picture of the gentleman sitting in a boxcar library dates to 1926. That was an early program where they would fill up a boxcar, specially fitted out, and put it on the railroad to be taken up to these wonderful branches up in logging camps and around the county, so that those workers could have access to books and other materials. They would take the car back every couple of weeks and replenish it, recirculate the books, and give them new things to read. So they were doing it even earlier than other communities. So whereas the Library Services Act significantly helped advance Montana's library programming, the 1964 Library Services and Construction Act stimulated the physical transformation of many of the state's libraries, including those originally constructed with Carnegie support. The federal program provided matching funds to materially increase and improve libraries' capacity to serve. Miles City and Custer County, who by then had merged into one library, took advantage of the program in 1965 to pay for an extensive remodel in addition to their original 1903 Carnegie building. Bums me out is that addition was put on the front of the building and kind of knocked out that wonderful original entrance designed by Charles Hare in 1903. And even though the space inside is lovely and it's important, they needed this space and they needed this wonderfully brightly lit area. It did kind of ruin the look of the original Carnegie building, and you really have to kind of go around every nook and cranny on the outside to see the elements of the original building in place. But if you go inside and you go up the stairs to the second story, they have the Montana room up there, which still has beautiful woodwork and is outfitted much like the original building was. So they have held on to some wonderful treasures in the Miles City Library. And of course, the other building that I have pictured here is the New Great Falls Library. It's a great new formalist building, but it was built on the exact spot where the original Carnegie Library stood. By 1981, Kalispell, Missoula, Malta, Chinook, and Bozeman had abandoned their Carnegies for new accommodations. The remaining 8 Carnegies underwent upgrades, expanding collections and programming, improving accessibility, building additions, and accommodating new technologies. Many of these changes were respectful of the building's original design and preserved their historic and architectural integrity. Women's clubs, librarians, community leaders, donors, voters, builders, and architects worked together to construct 17 Carnegie Public Libraries across Montana between 1902 and 1922. Librarians worked and continue to work, as you know, to serve their communities as critical sources of information. And I'll usually just close this talk with a poem written by Linnea Olmsted. She wrote it upon the retirement of her friend, who was also a librarian, and she called it The Librarian's Lament. And it goes like this. They ask for a book, the name quite absurd, the queerest title you've ever heard. One word of the title they seem to recall, the rest of the name they don't know at all. The book they say they think is read, it's about this big by a man who's dead. They don't know the author, they don't know the name, but insist on having the book just the same. Today, Montana's 15 surviving Carnegie library buildings represent the long-term commitment to education, social improvement, and civic responsibility of its early citizens. 9 of Montana's Carnegie libraries continue to serve their capacities as public libraries. 3 provide an alternative cultural experience as art venues. 2 tribute to their locality, providing office space, while one, the dear one in Malta, awaits rehabilitation. These Carnegie Libraries stand as cultural and architectural reminders that local history is connected to statewide and national events, programs, and trends, while also reflecting their community's identity and our common heritage. And Joe, I think that's it.
Well, thank you, Kate. I was chuckling off mic during your presentation at several of your comments because they're just so delightful, and this is such a great history. And I just want to say that I hope if you're watching the recording right now that you can appreciate how much work went into this book, to recounting this important history in Montana, and to just it's really great to make us librarians feel really good about the heritage that we're part of. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Joe. It's been wonderful. It's been just such a treat, especially getting out and meeting everybody. And I hopefully will be back on the road here soon and getting to visit each and every one of these communities.
Absolutely. So I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording, and we do have a few comments in the chat box that I'll share with you in just a sec.
Okay.